The morning Superintendent Aldrich Booker walked into Cedarwood Memorial Hospital. He wasn't wearing his badge. That was intentional. He wore a grey hoodie, a pair of worn jeans he'd had since his daughter's college graduation, and a baseball cap pulled low. His name tag read A. Booker, the kind of generic tag any patient or visitor might have clipped to their chest after stopping at the front desk. He carried a paper cup of coffee from the gas station across the street. Not the hospital cafeteria, because he didn't want anyone to see his face before he was ready. Aldrich had been doing this for 11 years. Walking into places where people expected power to look a certain way and letting them believe he was something less. He'd learned early in his career that the most honest version of any institution showed itself when it thought no one important was watching. Cedarwood Memorial had been flagged 3 times in the last 18 months, 3 complaints filed with the Illinois Department of Public Health. 2 from former nurses, 1 from a patient's family, all alleging the same pattern. Black and Latino patients in the emergency department were being triaged differently. Longer wait times, less pain medication. Doctors who breezed past curtains without stopping. A floor supervisor named Hargrove, who, according to 2 of the 3 complaints, had been heard saying things that had no business being said in a hospital or anywhere else. Aldrich wasn't supposed to be here personally. His office had investigators for this. Good ones, trained ones, people who filed meticulous reports and built airtight cases. But the 3rd complaint had included a name he recognized. A woman named Sylvia Odom, 73 years old, who had waited 4 hours in the Cedarwood Emergency Department with a fractured wrist before anyone set it. 4 hours. Her daughter had called Aldrich's office directly, crying so hard she could barely finish her sentences. He'd read the complaint 3 times. Then he'd driven to Cedarwood himself. He found a seat in the waiting area of the emergency department at 8:47 in the morning, between a young man with his arm wrapped in a dishcloth and an older woman who kept dabbing at her eye with a folded tissue. The room smelled like industrial cleaner, and something underneath it that cleaner was trying to cover. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A television mounted in the corner showed a morning news program with the sound muted, closed caption scrolling too slowly to keep up with what was being said. Aldrich watched. He had a small notebook in the front pocket of his hoodie and a voice recorder running in the chest pocket, both legal, under Illinois law for a state health official conducting a field assessment. He didn't need to write much down at first. The patterns were visible within 20 minutes. A white man in his 40s came in holding his chest, went straight to a triage nurse, was taken back within 6 minutes. A black woman in her late 30s came in with a toddler on her hip and her other hand pressed to her side. She checked in at the front desk. She was directed to the waiting area. She sat down 2 rows ahead of Aldrich. She was still there 40 minutes later. A Hispanic man in his 50s, visibly struggling to breathe, flagged down a passing nurse in scrubs. The nurse told him to wait for his name to be called. He sat back down. Aldrich watched the clock above the exit doors. At 9:34, a charge nurse, tall, white, badge reading Hargrove D., walked through the waiting area. She moved fast, clipboard against her chest, eyes scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to see only what she chose to see. She passed the woman with the toddler. She passed the man struggling to breathe. She stopped at the station near the front desk, said something to the intake coordinator, laughed at something the coordinator said, and went back through the double doors. The man who was struggling to breathe was taken back 11 minutes later. Not because Hargrove had flagged him, but because he had finally managed to get another nurse's attention by half-standing from his chair. Aldrich wrote 1 line in his notebook, pattern confirmed, not incidental. He went to the front desk at 10:15 and asked politely to speak with the department administrator. The young woman at the desk looked him up and down, hoodie, cap, gas station coffee, and told him the administrator was busy and he could leave a message. He said he'd wait. She said the administrator didn't typically come out to speak with patients or visitors. He said he understood that, and he would wait. Something in his voice must have landed differently than she expected, because she picked up the phone. The administrator who came out 12 minutes later was a man named Philip Durst. Mid-50s, fitted blazer, the kind of handshake that tried to establish hierarchy in the first 3 seconds. He looked at Aldrich with an expression that was doing its best to approximate professionalism while not quite hiding what was underneath. "Can I help you?" Durst said. I hope so, Aldrich said. I've been sitting in your waiting room since 8:47. I'd like to talk about what I observed. And you are? Aldrich didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of the gas station coffee, which was terrible, and set it on the counter. Let's go somewhere quiet, he said. This is going to be a longer conversation than you're expecting. Durst's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. A small recalibration. He'd expected irritation, maybe a complaint about wait times, something manageable. Something he could dispatch in 4 minutes, with a brochure about the hospital's patient experience initiative. He led Aldrich to a small conference room off the main corridor. It had a round table, 4 chairs, and a whiteboard someone had half erased. Durst sat across from him and folded his hands on the table in a way that communicated patience while communicating none. Now, Durst said, what seems to be the concern? 3 complaints, Aldrich said, filed with IDPH in the last 18 months. 2 from former staff, 1 from a patient's family. You're aware of them. Durst's face didn't move. We take all patient feedback seriously. I'm not talking about feedback, Aldrich said. I'm talking about formal complaints. Documented, logged, assigned case numbers. You responded to all 3 with a standard letter stating that an internal review had been conducted and no policy violations were found. A pause. Internal reviews are standard procedure, Durst said carefully. They are, Aldrich agreed. But they're not a substitute for external oversight when a pattern has been identified. And a pattern has been identified. He set his notebook on the table, turned it so Durst could see the notes from the morning. Times, observations, initials, the kind of specificity that could not be mistaken for casual complaining. This morning alone, in your emergency department, I documented multiple instances of differential triage response that align directly with the patterns described in all 3 complaints. I have a voice recording of the waiting room from 8:47 to 10:15. Durst looked at the notebook. He looked at Aldrich's hoodie. He looked at the cap. And Aldrich could see the math happening behind his eyes, the silent calculations that said, this man doesn't look like someone who can hurt me. I'm not sure what you think you observed, Durst said, but our triage protocols are based entirely on clinical presentation. Any variation in wait times reflects medical priority, not Philip. Durst stopped. Aldrich reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and set his credentials on the table. The official ID badge of the Illinois Department of Public Health, Superintendent's office, his photograph, his full name, his title, Superintendent of Health Facility Standards and Compliance. He placed it flat on the table and left it there. Durst stared at it. The room was very quiet. I've been the superintendent for 11 years, Aldrich said. His voice hadn't changed, still unhurried. My office has full authority to initiate formal investigations, suspend facility certifications, and recommend decertification to the director. We can also refer findings to the Office of the Inspector General and, where criminal conduct is indicated, to the State Attorney General. He picked up his coffee. It was still terrible. I came here this morning in personal clothing because I wanted to see this facility the way your patients see it, not the version you show when you know someone official is coming. The real version. He paused. I've seen enough. Durst's face had gone through several changes and had settled finally on something that was close to fear. Superintendent Booker, he started, I want to assure you, I'm going to need full access to your triage intake records for the past 24 months, Aldrich said. Stratified by patient demographics where that data was collected. I'm going to need personnel files for your charge nursing staff on the emergency floor. And I'm going to need the full records related to the internal reviews you conducted in response to those 3 complaints, not the summaries you sent to IDPH, the actual records. Some of that may require. It doesn't, Aldrich said. Not from my office. You can have your legal team call my deputy, but I'd encourage you not to spend too much time on that call, because your legal team is going to tell you the same thing I just did. He stood, picked up his notebook, slipped it back into his hoodie pocket. I'll be back on Thursday with my team. I'd like everything I mentioned ready for review. If there are documents that need to be pulled, I'd suggest starting now. He retrieved his badge from the table and walked to the door. Then he turned back. One more thing, he said. The woman in your waiting room this morning. Black woman, late 30s, had a child with her, checked in around 8:55. Last time I looked, she was still out there. Durst nodded rapidly. I'll personally make sure someone with a clinical background sees her, Aldrich said, not someone who walks past her and stops to laugh at the front desk. He let that land. Then he walked back out through the double doors, past the fluorescent lights and the industrial cleaner smell, through the waiting room where the woman with the toddler was, finally being called back, and out into the October morning, where the air was cold and clean, and the gas station across the street was just opening its second rush of the day. He threw away what remained of the terrible coffee. He sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine. He didn't feel triumphant. He rarely did. What happened in that conference room was not the hard part. The hard part was what came after. The records review, the personnel interviews, the legal challenges that Durst's team would absolutely attempt, regardless of what Aldrich had told him. The fight to make sure that whatever findings came out of Thursday actually led somewhere, rather than dissolving into the long, institutional amnesia that consumed so many of these cases. But he had walked in this morning and he had seen what he needed to see, and now he had something that 3 formal complaints had not been able to generate on their own. A first-hand account from a state superintendent who had sat in that waiting room for 90 minutes and documented everything. That mattered. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from his deputy, Renata Scholes, who had known him long enough to worry when he went quiet for a morning. "You okay? You were supposed to check in by 10. He typed back one-handed at the red light. "Just left Cedarwood. Start pulling the 2022-2023 incident database for that facility. We have a lot of work to do." 3 dots appeared. Then, that bad. He thought about the man who'd had to half-stand from his chair before anyone came. He thought about Sylvia Odom's daughter on the phone crying too hard to finish her sentences. That bad, he typed. Maybe worse. He drove back toward the city. Behind him, in the Cedarwood Memorial Administrative Wing, a man named Philip Durst was making phone calls he had not anticipated making that morning, in a voice that had lost most of the certainty it had started the day with. And on the 3rd floor of the same building, a charge nurse named Dee. Hargrove was finishing her rounds, with no idea that anything had changed, that the clipboard she carried, and the efficient way she had of not seeing certain people in certain waiting rooms had been watched and written down and recorded by someone who had every authority to make it matter. She would find out on Thursday, they all would. The Thursday inspection did not go the way Durst had hoped. Aldrich arrived at 7:45 with 4 members of his compliance team, 2 of them former hospital administrators themselves, one a former ER nurse with 20 years of experience and a reputation for reading facility culture the way other people read weather. They came with laptops, with structured data request forms, with a copy of the formal investigation notice that had been filed with Cedarwood's board of directors 2 days earlier. The legal team Durst had assembled, 3 attorneys from a firm that specialized in healthcare defense, all of them immaculate in the way that expensive defense attorneys tended to be, was already waiting in the main conference room. The lead attorney, a woman named Schultz, who had clearly done her homework over the past 48 hours, stood when Aldrich came in and extended her hand with the professional warmth of someone who understood that warmth was, at this point, the only available strategy. "Superintendent Booker," she said, "we appreciate you coming in person. I want to assure you that Cedarwood Memorial is fully committed to transparency in this process." "Good," Aldrich said. "Then this will go quickly." It did not go quickly. The records review took 6 hours. Aldrich's team had requested triage intake logs sorted by patient demographic indicators: race, insurance status, primary language, and what came back was a document architecture that had clearly been designed to make that kind of analysis as difficult as possible. Fields that should have been standardized were inconsistent. Certain records were missing demographic data entirely, in ways that were not random. The team worked through it methodically, building a picture that grew clearer the longer they looked. The patterns were not subtle. Black patients in the emergency department waited an average of 41 minutes longer for initial triage contact than white patients presenting with comparable chief complaints. Hispanic patients waited 34 minutes longer. The disparity held across different times of day, different days of the week, different presenting symptoms. It was not the product of any single person's decision. It was the product of a system that had been allowed to operate this way long enough that it had stopped noticing itself. At 2 in the afternoon, they interviewed Hargrove. She came in, composed, the kind of composed that takes effort to maintain, and sat across from Aldrich and two members of his team with her hands folded on the table in a posture that might have looked calm to someone who didn't know what to look for. "We're going to ask you some questions about your triage oversight procedures," Aldrich said. "You're not required to have legal representation present, but you're welcome to request it." "I'm fine," Hargrove said. They walked her through the morning of Aldrich's visit, the intake logs from that morning, the timestamps, the specific cases. She had answers for all of it. Answers that were technically coherent, medically framed, built around clinical language that was intended to make differential outcomes sound inevitable rather than chosen. Aldrich listened to all of it. Then he set a printed transcript on the table in front of her, a section of the voice recording from the waiting room, time-stamped, her interaction with the intake coordinator, the laugh, the return through the double doors. He pointed to a name on the intake log next to a timestamp. "This patient had been waiting for 53 minutes at the point you walked through the waiting room," he said. "Her chief complaint, as logged, was abdominal pain, rated 7 out of 10 on the intake form. The clinical threshold for expedited triage in your own facility's protocol is a pain rating of 6 or above." Hargrove looked at the paper. "I wasn't aware," she started. "The log shows the intake form was completed 14 minutes before you walked through," Aldrich said. "It was clipped to the board at the station you passed." The composure slipped. Not dramatically. A tightening around the eyes, a recalibration of the folded hands. "These cases are complex," she said. "We deal with high volume." "I understand high volume," the former ER nurse on Aldrich's team said. Her name was Dr. Celestine Price, and she had a way of entering a conversation that made clear she had heard every version of this particular explanation. "I worked emergency medicine for 20 years. High volume explains inconsistency. It doesn't explain a directional pattern that holds across 2 years of data." The interview lasted another 90 minutes. At 4:30, Aldrich's team gathered in a smaller room down the hall, away from the attorneys and administrators, and went through what they had. The data was solid. The documentation was solid. The interview had added to the picture rather than complicating it. This was the kind of case that, built correctly, held up. Dr. Price leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. "The systemic findings are clear," she said. "The question is individual culpability. Hargrove is part of it. But this didn't start with Hargrove." "It didn't," Aldrich agreed. "Durst knew about the complaints. 3 of them over 18 months. He signed off on internal reviews that cleared everyone. That's either incompetence or something worse." "The board knew too," said Marcus Webb, the data analyst on the team. He was 29 and had joined Aldrich's office after 2 years at a health equity non-profit, and he had the particular talent of being able to hold an enormous amount of numerical information in his head without losing the human meaning of it. The third complaint was escalated to board level. "There's a memo." "There's a memo," Aldrich repeated. "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment. "All right," Aldrich said. "We write this up clean and complete. Everything documented. I want the draft report to me by end of next week. We'll do a formal presentation to IDPH before we notify the facility." He paused. "And I want to make sure the 3 complainants are contacted directly. Especially the family from the 3rd complaint. They deserve to hear from us before this becomes public." He thought about Sylvia Odom's daughter again. The phone call that had brought him here. "They waited a long time for someone to take this seriously," he said. "Let's not make them wait any longer than they have to." The report was filed 6 weeks later. It ran to 114 pages and documented systematic disparities in emergency triage practices, failures of internal oversight, and a compliance culture that had, for at least 3 years, treated patient complaints as administrative problems to be managed, rather than safety issues to be addressed. The Illinois Department of Public Health placed Cedarwood Memorial on provisional certification status, with a 90-day remediation plan and mandatory external monitoring. Hargrove was suspended pending further review. Durst resigned before the board had the chance to ask him to. 3 board members who had received the escalated complaint and signed off on the internal review without initiating independent inquiry were referred for review by the state's hospital licensing authority. It was not the end of the story. These things rarely were. Provisional certification led to legal challenges, as Aldrich had anticipated. The remediation plan generated disputes about implementation. Hargrove's attorney began building a defense around the complexity of emergency department operations and the difficulty of proving intent. The board members' review moved at the pace that regulatory reviews moved when the people under review had resources and a reason to slow things down. But the findings were public. The data was public. The 114 pages existed and could not be unmade. And in the record, in the formal documentation that would follow this case wherever it went, there was a section near the beginning that described the initial site visit. An investigator who had arrived unannounced and spent 90 minutes in the waiting room, observing, who had seen the woman with the toddler, who had noted the timestamps, who had been looked at by a man in a conference room and found, in that man's estimation, to be someone unlikely to cause him trouble. Aldrich had written that section himself. He wrote it plainly, without editorial, the way a formal investigation record required. But he chose his words carefully, because words in a formal record lasted, and he wanted anyone who read this in 5 years or 10 years or 20 to understand what had happened in that waiting room, not just the data, the reality underneath the data. The woman who had waited, the man who had half stood from his chair, the charged nurse who had passed them both and stopped to laugh at the front desk. He filed the report on a Tuesday morning, and then he drove to see his mother, who lived 40 minutes outside the city, and who he hadn't seen in 3 weeks. She was 71 and in good health, and still grew tomatoes in the backyard, even in October, which she insisted worked if you knew what you were doing. She made him lunch and asked about his work, and he told her the broad outlines, the way he always did. She listened the way she always had, with the particular quality of attention that had nothing to perform, that was just actually listening. "You did good," she said when he finished. "We did the work," he said. "Whether it does good depends on what happens next." She handed him another piece of cornbread and told him that was always true of everything, which was not as comforting as it might have sounded, but which was, also he had come to understand, the only honest thing anyone could say. He drove back to the city in the late afternoon, when the light was low and orange across the flat Illinois landscape, and he thought about the next case. There was always a next case. And about the woman in the waiting room whose name he had never learned, who had sat for 53 minutes, with a child on her hip and pain rated 7 out of 10, and who had finally been called back, not because the system had corrected itself, but because one person had walked in off the street on an October morning and decided to stay long enough to see. That was the job. Not triumph, not resolution, just the stubborn, necessary act of witnessing, and then making sure the witness went somewhere. He had been doing it for 11 years. He planned to keep doing it.